A more contested pluralism is emerging in world politics. Increasing strategic competition between the West, China, and Russia are at times articulated as a clash of political systems. It is being debated whether the current international order is too infused with Western ideas and need to be opened up to more non-Western perspectives. These developments reintroduce questions of the value and future of political pluralism in international society and world politics. That is the topic of this roundtable. The participants will consider and explore the extent to which political pluralism is a desirable principle for constructing international order, and the extent to which this principle is currently being challenged. They have been invited to look at historical experience, to discuss current practice, and ultimately to reflect on pathways for international policy. This roundtable on political pluralism and international order is a collaboration between the Center for Statecraft and International Order at Roskilde University and the International Orders Research Unit at LSE Ideas. I'm Dr. Laust Shouenborg, and I'll be chairing this roundtable. And I'm joined by a distinguished group of scholars. I have Dr. Courtney Fung from McKeil University with me, Dr. Engbo Gissel from Roskilde University, Professor Andrew Hurrell from Oxford University, Dr. McKeil from the London School of Economics, and last but not least, Dr. Sasikumar Sundaram from City University of London. Each have been given 5 minutes to speak to a particular dimension of this topic, and Professor Hurrell has agreed to set the scene for us. After the initial short presentations, we will turn to general debate. And I'll now hand over the stage to Professor Andrew Hurrell. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation and for letting me join in. I thought I'd just begin by saying a very few words about how I see the context. I'm sure other people will have different views on that, and then I'll make a few general points. In terms of the context, one side, it seems to me, comes from the idea that recent international law and society has kind of overreached itself, obviously in one form to do with the specifics of the so-called Western-led global liberal order and all of the problems that it's generated. I won't go there. We all, I'm sure, know and have a lot to say on that. But more generally, the feeling that international law has been normatively overambitious. Think of the role of the ICC and the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine, and that therefore one place to go is to return to a more limited pluralist order with sovereignty, balance of power, non-intervention much more strongly again as features. So that's one part of the context. The other part of the context, in a sense, comes from within liberalism, and to say, well, yes, but the global liberal order version of liberalism is only one version of liberalism. There's always been a tradition of liberalism which has laid a great emphasis on pluralism, and that if we want to find a world where liberals can live reasonably well, but that also speaks to many of the demands to reflect deep diversity and accentuated pluralism, this is one place we should be looking. So that's kind of how I sort of see the context. And let me make then 5 very kind of brief bullet points. The first, in international society writing, English school writing, which has often sort of contrasted this kind of pluralist vision versus solidarist ambition, in the way that story is being told, there's been a huge amount of ideology and misreading. So classically, we in the West wanted to push towards a better solidarist society, and the developing third world was wedded to old-fashioned notions of Westphalia and sovereignty. All of the work in the past 10, 15, 20 years has worked to show that that's nonsense, basically. The southern source of global norms, southern cosmopolitanism, all of these things. Again, I won't go into detail, but I think that view has been very successfully challenged. Secondly, diversity is never kind of natural. It's not just out there. It takes a political form precisely because of political process. And there are 2 kinds of ways. One is a kind of long-standing view of how society, human society, develops. And I think in one of the things I circulated for this, Felipe Amesto, the global environmental historian, has a view that challenges kind of liberal convergent stories by saying, actually, globalization, integration, interdependence, because of the mutability and imagination of human beings, constantly produces and reproduces pluralism. That's one aspect. But the other is, of course, the diffusion of political agency. It's precisely because agency, both interstate power, but also broader diffusion of agency has diffused, that more states and society are able to lay claim to have their own pluralist view of the world reflected in international law and society. So the second point. Third point, that it's really important, I think, to distinguish between the kind of institutions that might go along with a pluralist view of international law and society from the value of pluralism itself, per se. So the institutions, I think, we often classically think of a balance of power. It's hard to think of a viable pluralist world without some sort of balanced power. Equally, it's hard to think of a pluralist world without some sort of law which lays emphasis on at least agreement about what law is, how it's made, how it changes, probably with quite a lot of emphasis on consent and formality. So balance of power, international law. The strand of Republican liberalism recently has laid great emphasis on collective agency. It's one thing to be told you're an equal participant in a pluralist world, but what Republican liberalism has done is to say, well, no, it's not just that. You groups actually have to have the effective power to resist alien domination and to place their own agenda on the table. Fourthly, we do turn to the value of political pluralism, thinking and talking particularly out of Western liberalism. Sometimes we kind of get a kind of Mill type, well, experiments in living, diversity is kind of good. Sometimes we kind of get an Isaiah Berlin kind of natural incommensurability of values and so on. My own, again, very schematically, place where I think there's a lot to be learned is a more Arendtian, Hannah Arendt view of pluralism, not just as a kind of natural condition of humanity, but where we ground liberal demands for freedom not in abstract notions of rights, but precisely in threats to see where pluralism is threatened with potential eradication. So it's precisely the defense of pluralism against those who would crush it that should be and potentially could be the basis for a kind of liberal grounding of why a pluralist world matters. And then finally, and I'll stop here, of course, this all speaks to a kind of classical, maybe old-fashioned world of seeing good fences make good neighbors. I was brought up on the egg box metaphor of international society. Order is about the egg box protecting the eggs. The problem, of course, is that we can't just see pluralism in terms of what happens at the border, in terms of minimum coexistence, precisely because globalization challenges, but even more planetary challenges, demand much deeper agreement on how and why order is to be created. And that doesn't mean that pluralism doesn't matter, particularly those minimum institutions. I think they're crucially important, the procedural ones, the balance of power, consent-based law, effective agency, and so on. But they have to be part of something that is much more far-reaching than simply saying, we want a world where we can live together and do as little damage to each other as possible.
Thank you, Hurrell, for that very good introduction. And I'll now hand it over to Courtney Fung from McKeil University.
Thank you so much, Laust and colleagues and Andrew, for a very sort of rousing kickoff. I think maybe I will pick up on some of the concepts about good fences making good neighbors in particular, as I sort of discuss the context of the current People's Republic of China's engagement in an administration of what their elites view as suitable outcomes of international order. So maybe I should begin with a preface to note that I think we are at a point where we can see features of order. And again, I will take the sort of Hedley Bull 1977 understanding of order being defined as the relevant norms, rules, and procedures that help regulate international activities by developing patterns of behavior amongst states. A very clear interest and almost fixation with trying to understand ways in which China can engage and help modify this international order by its own active participation in pockets of global governance issues. And I think in the Q&A, we can get more into these sort of applied cases. I'd also make the case in the preface to my comments that pluralism is certainly a feature in the way that Chinese strategic thought, Chinese elites try and engage and signal that they are looking to try and expand the number of voices. Exactly as Andrew noted, this belief that we have understood now in the last 10, 15 years of scholarly research, that Southern voices, so-called norm development from below, is actually a perpetual feature of the way that international order is constructed and reconstructed. And this is a very interesting opening for Chinese officials that are very keen to talk about the democracy of international relations, the opposition to hegemony of sort of Western ideas, sometimes even the opposition of one particular great state that won't get mentioned in the speeches, the idea that the multipolar world order has arrived and is indeed here, and institutions no longer reflect the actual power distribution in the system today. And again, the constant refrain for the need to have equality and equity in the way that we understand and design global governance and international political processes. I would argue, though, that we are now, in my second point, we are now at this phase where China is looking to try and repackage these types of long-term threads in the way that China has understood its place and regarded the world around it, into this language now, the last decade of this discussion of there being this, what they call a shared future, or a community of common destiny of humankind or mankind. But I think the shared future is kind of where it's going now. It's a little bit easier if it's in translation. And this is a very broad concept. Many grandfathers, intellectual grandmothers have helped shape it. There's excellent research pointing out it has Marxist, communist, Confucian roots. It has elements of sort of global South, global North divide. There are many combinations of political thinkers that help shape what is the concept that is now promoted by Chinese elites. But I would argue, as we think about shared future, it contains essentially 4 key elements that I think tell us a lot about what Chinese elites are thinking about pluralism and what they're thinking about order. So for all of this language about the flatness and the non-hierarchical pursuit of the way that we should govern the globe and govern problems and processes in which states have to interact with one another, shared future is fundamentally about a by-states, for-states system. Civil society groups, concepts of universal values, concepts of other players being invited in, whether they be businesses, civil society, NGOs, atypical actors, youth groups, etc. They are invited in as part of the democracy of international relations. Small states are invited in as the democracy of international relations. But really, this is a system based on power politics, where great states have a say. And while all states are meant to be equal players, China itself is the first amongst these equals. There is the implicit assumption that there will be the acceptance of sort of the applicability and the appropriateness of the Chinese governance system and the Chinese approach to thinking about international politics, again, in this much more by states, for states, fundamental, really narrow interpretation of documents like the UN Charter. A second feature of this shared future, again, somewhat interesting, is this tension that it should be based on an interest-based understanding of what cooperation can be grounded in. So it is selected and selective moments of cooperation that should be values-free based. So in the sense that we can set aside core concerns regarding human rights, perhaps, and as long as we can find means to negotiate on questions of trade, then 2 actors, China and another economy, should be able to operate effectively on that economic angle. The last feature that I think is very interesting, as I've talked about the sort of hierarchical sense of sort of the Chinese system being preferable and the first amongst equals, it is still, again, underlined with this real concept of universal exceptionalism. And I think this is where this shared future has a very interesting opening for a number of players that also feel like they've been left outside of sort of the mainstream storytelling of how we've ended up with our current international order. And I'll just close on this point. So much of this language now is really advancing the case that every single state has had a unique story of their economy, of their history, of their society. And this therefore develops a unique need for particular values, for the need to reject a universal standard, universal values, again, like human rights, or the need to reinterpret how we understand how these universal rights would apply to unique core conditions. And so the fact that every state is exceptional, therefore now means that there really is no such thing as a universal guide apart from the fact of this universal exceptionalism. So I think a lot of this appears to be quite circular, but in many ways it does provide a number of very interesting intellectual openings for the way that Chinese officials are engaging with society around them. So if I can take in my last minute one example of this, I think now June 13, I believe, is the day that has been designated, and I might be wrong on the actual date, but it is now one of these days that will be designated as World Civilizational Dialogue Day. And this is one of these sort of attempts to operationalize what this shared future means. Dialogues can occur without there being standards, without there being guidance, without there being direct outcomes. We can have dialogues on many things in which we find opportunities to converse, opportunities to try and understand one another, but we're not looking to hold each other to account per se. Civilizational bearers are now states, and so states that believe they also have a very unique pedigree are also quite interested in this concept. And so there's been a lot of discussion in the way that China has sought to designate and reinvigorate this interest in World Civilizational Dialogue Day, seen as an expression of its shared future world vision, but again, a real attempt to try and advance this pluralistic discussion, and potentially, for those that worry about this, at cost of there being clearer understandings about state responsibilities, or about there being state rights, or about the way that other cultural forebearers, like individuals, like NGOs, like civil society groups, could also be involved in something that is inherently going to be a state-centric approach to understanding individuality and pluralism. But let me stop there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. And then over to Dr. Line Engbo Gissel.
Thank you so much. You can hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you so much. In this presentation, I'll revisit one of the most so-called cosmopolitan projects of the 1990s, which were the negotiations to establish the ICC. One of the most pressing questions posed by today's world order, I think, is whether the design of some of these progressive regimes of the 1990s are actually undermining the relevance and justice in a more plural order. So in the 90s, states built a lot of international law and legal institutions. They ratified human rights treaties, established monitoring bodies and new international courts, and negotiated a lot of bilateral investment treaties, for instance. So this decade is seen like states were busy building an international rule of law. They also created the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and I believe that it's worth revisiting this constitutive moment to try and think about whether we can learn from this process of negotiation to build this international criminal court. So we are told that in the negotiations to establish this ICC, we had a process of cosmopolitanism that defeated statism, or that progressive states persuaded conservative states to adopt their vision for the ICC. And the struggle between these two worldviews constitutes the narrative epic that gives meaning to the ICC of today. And it's even inspired scholars to analyze the negotiations in terms of the so-called like-minded states versus just other states. But in this narrative also hides from view and makes invisible, I would argue, the concerns of many non-Western states. And these concerns are worth revisiting now that the world order is transitioning to what looks like a more plural constellation. In fact, many African and Asian states, they advocated a different ICC to the one that became the ICC in 2002. And many of them wanted a more consent-based jurisdiction. They wanted court independence from major powers and, of course, the UN Security Council. And they sought an anchoring in sovereign equality. But what is also interesting is that all states, they tended to use the same terms, but they meant very different things with those terms. And court independence is one of those terms, which I like to look at a bit more. Another term is complementarity. So the central question back then and today as well was whether in an international order that is based formally on state sovereignty, how much and which form of consent by states is required for this jurisdiction or for this court to operate. And that was the central question that animated the debate on establishing this court. So there was a consensual vision which was expressed a lot by Asian and African and some Eastern European and Latin American states. Excuse me. So they argued that express and specific consent given by a state to an international court is a prerequisite to jurisdiction, and also that any adjudication should take place with the assent of the party concerned. They spoke a lot along the lines of the court that we know today as the International Court of Justice, which has a much more consent-based jurisdiction than a lot of the international courts that were established in the 1990s. So India, for instance, welcomed a 1994 draft because it required state consent for adjudication. And Indonesia stressed that no state should be bound without giving that consent. But also states like Japan, Belarus, Israel, Singapore, Thailand, Uganda, China, and again India, they saw a trade-off, and they kept talking about this trade-off between jurisdiction and universality. And I think that's very interesting in the light of today's challenges. They were arguing that the more compulsory jurisdiction, i.e. the more sovereignty costs, the less participation by states would such a regime achieve. Sovereign equality was also very important. Japan and Romania, for instance, argued that there needed to be room for reservation and an extensive right of choice. But also the meanings of these terms really differed across groups of states. So the advocates of a progressive vision for the ICC, they saw in the notion of complementarity a protection of sovereignty. They were saying that the court should have inherent jurisdiction over serious crimes, but because of complementarity, there would also be a protection of sovereignty. But sort of statist or conservative or global south states, they saw complementarity as actually the opposite of inherent jurisdiction. So they also argued for complementarity, but they saw in complementarity a court that would give states the right to bring criminals to justice in their own justice systems if they preferred it. And they didn't see a hierarchy between the ICC and national courts. Lastly, I wanted to just briefly discuss also the idea of independence, which I think has become a very important concept in international criminal justice and in international justice more broadly. Because many global South states, they of course advocated an independent court. And by that they meant independence from strong states and from the UN Security Council. But many of the more what could be called progressive states, the states that got the court they wanted, they wanted to have design features that created court independence, not necessarily from major states or powerful states, but from the states that were implicated in atrocity. So in that sense, states sort of used the same terms and negotiated this institution, but in the process, it became a regime that does not respect state consent so much, and therefore also I think becomes increasingly controversial, and maybe we'll see more states leaving the regime as a result. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then Dr. Aaron McKeil has the floor.
Right, thank you, Laust. On this topic, I'm interested in the character of new pluralism that we're seeing in world politics today. But I'm also interested in the collapse of globalism, the retreat of cosmopolitanism, what's becoming of it in this new context. Remarkably, in January of this year, Vladimir Putin visited the Kant Museum in Kaliningrad. What an official Russian interpretation of Kantian philosophy would be, I struggle to imagine. Contradictions are too obvious. International politics today are dividing up in imperfect ways. When asked what is the secret of politics, Bismarck replied, a good treaty with Russia. Today it seems to me that a good treaty, at least with Russia, is unlikely. What's more, if Bismarck were here today, he would likely be signing up to join NATO. International politics is dividing in quite concerning ways. Rousseau described international society as the imperfect society, but he also argued that St. Pierre's federative peace proposal was impossible to achieve except by revolution. And even then, that it might do more harm than the harm it was meant to prevent. Times have dramatically changed in recent years, and so have pervasive ideas of history. The cosmopolitan wave from the post-Cold War moment was rolled back with the revolt against globalism and the pushback against the global West from Russia and China. In my book project, I attempt to explore how larger patterns are evident here, and how attempts to unify international society have tended to be followed by more division and disorder than was before. I find that the collapse of globalism is the latest in a series of cosmopolitan waves in the modern international experience. The book explores 4 of these, overlapping in time and space: Kantian liberal cosmopolitanism, world communism, post-colonial cosmopolitanism, and the newer green cosmopolitan wave. The book, of course, distinguishes different types of cosmopolitanism that way, where upper C, narrowly defined cosmopolitanism I take to be the Kantian tradition, where the lower C, broadly defined cosmopolitan category, I see more as ways of imagining human belonging on a wider scale. Although there's varied ways of imagining cosmopolitan belonging, some more institutional, others more internationalist, I find that they all have tended to have a futurological aspect in the modern imagination. Tennyson's Locksley Hall still expresses that way of imagining human belonging in a future sense, right? The Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World in future. In his later years, Tennyson returned to this old poem in another he wrote called Locksley Hall, 60 years after. In the late 19th century, in his later years, he still held out hope that this future would come to be. And he had this lovely line in it: when all the schemes and kingdoms fall, something higher, holier, kindlier, all for each and each for all, with a question mark, yes. In the wake of globalism today, more than 100 years later, I think critical damage has been done to these modern meta-narratives of how we imagine cosmopolitan belonging. The future and the stories we tell about it are less clear than they were almost even a decade ago. In hindsight, the collapse of globalism and neoliberal commercial cosmopolitanism was unsurprising because of its conceits about the end of history, made it unable to sympathize with acute inequalities at home and deep cultural differences abroad. Studying these ways of imagining global belonging, I find that when they are connected to foreign policies and political movements, revolutionary or otherwise, they tend to generate hierarchy, legitimation conflicts, recognition struggles, usually in the forms of resurgent exclusionary nationalisms. These cosmopolitan waves have had a drive towards solidarity and unity, but also they have contained some elements of pluralism. World communism did change over the years with its different leaders. Under Khrushchev, for example, it did have a notion of peaceful coexistence, and post-colonial cosmopolitanism was the most thoroughly deep pluralist in some of its expressions. The new illiberal authoritarian powers today, seeking a multipolar international order, have a cultural nationalist tenor to this vision, a multi-civilizational international order. And the revolt against globalism and pushback against the West. The cosmopolitan culture that was slowly and thinly and unevenly spreading across international society dissolved, it's become dispelled, delegitimated, thrown back. Pluralism today is contested, I think deeply contested, rather than embedded. There is a new or neo-non-aligned movement re-emerging across the global south, but it does not clearly, at least from what I can tell, contain that older sense of post-colonial cosmopolitanism. What comes next and how it plays out, I'm not sure. But in this context, I find that cosmopolitans after globalism may do better about thinking about the contemporary injustices and disorder in world politics today than thinking about global solutions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron McKeil. And then our final speaker, Dr. Sasikumar Sundaram.
Thank you very much. I'll start with a very brief paraphrasing of famous Indian Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in 1994. And he said that ideas are successful when it is plural, but when the rainbows of ideas are fused into a monochromatic beam, it leads to simple judgments of right and wrong. What Rao asks us is to reflect on the continuities of pluralism as the sort of a normal condition of world politics or international politics, and attacks the hubris that somehow pluralism can be tamed and it could lead to some sort of global hegemony and so on. We are asked here to reflect on political pluralism, if it is desirable for constructing international order, and to the extent to which it is challenged. That pluralism is challenged is not under any doubt. There is populists, nationalists, radical left and radical right involved in polarized debates on the future of international system. But I want to focus on the sort of challenges to pluralism that comes from the global south, particularly because some of these states, such as India and Brazil, are normally now categorized as swing states. The way in which they deal with the international order or questions on liberal international order very much can tilt the balance of world politics in one way or the other. But I'd also like to focus on the sort of challenges that these global south states bring. And the sort of challenge is rhetorical. So one of the fundamental sort of question that interests me is why defend pluralism with rhetoric? And we see this continuation of defending pluralism with rhetoric, both in the Western world, where there was a rhetoric of cosmopolitanism, there was a rhetoric of defending notions of the International Criminal Court, as we saw in the previous presentation, but also there is a continued emphasis on rhetoric to defend pluralism in Global South. for many members in the Global South, and let me take an example of India, Brazil, and China. India's rhetoric for a very long time, not quite recently, has been the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, or the world is one family. It is a rhetorical intervention in order to articulate a particular notion of global plurality. Brazil's famous president, Juscelino Kubitschek, said, the world, we'd like to be part of the West, but not constitute its proletariat. And we also have rhetoric of China's civilizational state, or with a state with Chinese characteristics, international system with Chinese characteristics. What rhetoric on pluralism does to the Global South states is that it brings more voice. It enables them to articulate their ideas under conditions of being silenced within the existing system where epistemic violence is rampant. But also rhetoric offers the seed to provide a different alternative views of the international system. Perhaps a view that is quite largely missed if we kind of fuse existing voices as somehow liberal in one way or the other. And they do emphasize pluralism through rhetoric, but this is the rub. It becomes a snake that bites its own tail. So the more rhetoric is used to defend pluralism, it rests on the very principle of pluralism because it gives opportunities for non-Western states to articulate their different viewpoints. But the more they articulate their different viewpoints, it becomes, as I said, snake that bites its own tail, where the very foundations and principles of defending pluralism collapses. Now, I want to press on 3 important points towards how to sort of think about these problems that comes particularly from the Global South states, and how the rhetoric of Global South states can enable sort of to discipline or chastise the West. One, the rhetoric of Global South states, if we understand the sort of fundamental premise of that, is to attack the hubris of understanding that the world, in fact, can be dominated with one particular global hegemony. What the rhetoric of pluralism shows is that the world, in fact, is plural from the very beginning, and it will always be plural, and any attempts to sort of arrest this flow of the normal flow of pluralism is the problem. And that is a very valid point, I would think. The second important point is this liberalism of fear, or what is the notion that somehow there is a view that we have to defend pluralism because what if we don't? And that leads to particular regimes of fear that has governed liberalism for a very long time, most importantly in the form of liberal imperialism. So what the rhetoric of the Global South states, in fact, shows is that we do not need to be in the sort of the fear of somehow liberalism or pluralism collapsing. It is actually the problem being sort of how liberalism overtakes as a particular way to capture this fear in order to articulate coercive solidarism. And last but not the least is that the rhetoric of the Global South states makes an important distinction between rules-based international order and liberal international order. When rhetoric is enforced to talk about pluralism, they are happy to talk about rules-based order because that is conducive to sort of manage different plural entities and groups within the societies. And it can also be quite disenchanting, as we know, but they are quite open and accepting of the rules-based understanding of pluralism. But they are not quite happy with liberal understanding of international order. So if we pay attention to the rhetoric of Global South states, perhaps these 3 factors will enable us to think about the future of international order that is much more embracing of the differences. But the bigger philosophical question is how to stop the snake from biting its own tail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sasikumar Sundaram, for your very insightful and provocative observations. It's clear to me that there are many different meanings of pluralism out there, and that some of them compete. And as Sundaram just pointed out, some interventions might also collapse the very meaning of some versions of pluralism. Many interesting observations, coexistence brought up by Hurrell, civilizational dialogue by Fung, and the room or not for cosmopolitanism and the different versions of sovereignty embodied in the ICC and the international legal regime. I'll now open it up to reactions. Those were my initial impressions. Does anyone want to start? Yeah, Professor Hurrell, go ahead.
Well, I just have 3 points that I think come out of this and of the contributions that we've just heard. The first is, and sort of reaction to the language of dialogue, is that there's nothing easy or automatic about dialogue. Dialogue depends on an enormous amount of shared meaning and shared institutions. What's always interested me has been, what are the minimal conditions for there to be able to be some notion of society? And, a shared language, both a literal but also a metaphorical language, a shared framework of ideas of, states' responsibility, all of these things, what it means to contract, all of these sort of foundational, sometimes people talking about sort of epistemic preconditions in a Hobbesian world. All of those things have to be there. And the problem with the kind of grand, let's have civilizational dialogue, is that it has to answer, well, where's that going to come from if it doesn't build on and around the existing things that are there in the international legal diplomatic order? Now, that's not to say that those process things as they stand are in any way adequate, because clearly they reflect all sorts of historic biases, injustices, and so on. But the question of, well, yes, dialogue, but what does it depend on, I think is crucial. Second point is that, of course, order making can happen without lots of nice dialogue. I mean, I think one of the ways of thinking about order in a kind of geopolitically more rivalrous world is precisely about competitive order making. I mean, think of cyber and cyber governance. We have, US models, European models, Chinese models. Some of them will be embedded in regions, but a lot of them will be there, developed to be thrown out for other people to contest and pick up. And so that notion of competitive rulemaking is something that China is clearly engaged in, which is very different from the kind of dialogic model. And then the third one is about values. I mean, I find the notion that values only live, or universal values only live, in a certain kind of box, like human rights, democracy. Various people have picked up this idea that we can think of order in terms of layers, sort of Westphalian, UN Charter, multilateral global governance, liberal world order. And we can kind of take out the top one because there isn't enough agreement, all the things we've said, and we can leave the others sort of there. But it's very difficult to think about, managing planetary challenges without, I mean, universal might not be the right word. Universal's too big, too grand, but without strongly shared sets of agreed values, even if they're not absolutely universal. So that notion that we can sort of take some of the functional stuff and leave the other stuff aside just doesn't seem to me to have a warrant, either historically or theoretically. So there'll be my 3 kind of comeback points, kind of defending a procedural view about the importance of international law and society as a global set of institutions, not as a Western set, but as a global set of institutions.
Thank you, Hurrell. And I see Line Gissel has her hand up. So Line Gissel, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll try to enter this room a bit more elegant this time. So I wanted to pick up, going back to the point about taking inspiration from Hannah Arendt, because it's true, she highlights, of course, the importance of differences and disagreement, but she also introduces this idea, I think, of disobedience. And of course, he wants to save politics. But politics can mean so many things. So how can we think, and it's not to say that there has not been politics in different international orders, and that politics have not brought us to the point where we are now, of course. So it's more the question of what sort of politics then should we look towards in this changing world order. And something which I think is quite undervalued at the moment, and which maybe we can take a metaphor from Hannah Arendt to think with, is basically that she talks about the table as a metaphor. So let's imagine we have a table between us now, even though it's a virtual meeting. She's arguing that that table unites us, but it also separates us. So it makes us actually remain different. Because it separates us. It doesn't sort of turn us into one unit. And that table, of course, is also is a sort of very useful metaphor in terms of thinking politically, because around that table, we will have a negotiation, but also compromise. So I think, and what I think went wrong sort of in the 90s, where a lot of these institutions were created that are now seen as more sort of problematic by newer actors or more stronger states that were weaker in the 90s, is that around the table, there was not equality. So there was, of course, formal equality, but sort of informally a lot of inequality. So yeah, so I just wanted to sort of pick up that idea of course, dialogue, but based on sort of a different valuation or appreciation of equality. And that's probably not given freely or voluntarily. So I don't have a solution to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Other reactions? Yeah, Sundaram, go ahead.
Thank you. You can call me Sashi. That's, I think, the easier part from now on. I liked the discussion so far, and it is a fantastic way to sort of think about the two tensions which comes up again and again. One is that dialogue is just not enough or automatic, because we will have to have some sort of an epistemic precondition for dialogue to happen at all. And that working with the table or around the table in order to find a compromise. And to a large extent, many global South states have found these principles to be correct and acceptable, but given the sort of historical conditions under which they were integrated unequally into the international system, there were no equal avenues for establishing dialogue or even articulating their epistemic preconditions in the first place. And there were also sort of their own concerns about planetary challenges that came about much more earlier than what is talked about in recent years with climate change and global poverty and economic inequality, among others. So the concerns of the global South states pretty much is rhetorical, because since we have not been heard in the past and we've been unequally integrated, and there is no equal opportunities for us to articulate our views in a rather polite sort of way, we might want to get rhetorical, and that sort of emphasis gets reproduced again and again in the sort of international system. So I think one of the questions that I want to ask to Professor Hurrell and also to Lene is that, given the fact or the empirical fact that we know that there is an unequal integration of some states, particularly the global South states, into the international system, and given that they had genuine legitimate concerns about planetary challenges that were articulated at least since the early 19th century onwards, or the mid-late 19th century and early 20th century onwards. And given the fact that the tables have always been unequal to articulate viewpoints, and the notion that they are getting rhetorical, what is the best way to sort of resolve these problems? What are the ways through which we could think about the changing nature of the political itself under these sort of unequal exchanges?
Very good questions, and of course, Hurrell and Gissel are welcome to come in here, but I'll also open it up to McKeil and Fung if they would like an intervention at this stage?
I mean, you know what else does? I'm happy just to
Go ahead, Andrew.
Come back, because I think that's exactly the right question. I just think one point we haven't mentioned is that, of course, the challenges are not just coming from outside this Western world that wanted to, push this particular view of where international law and society. We've seen the backlash and the polarization deeply within Western societies. And so the question is a question of how do we make sure that we have the participation in a plural world of, emerging powers, the developing world, China, and so on. But it also very, very powerfully and very problematically is how do we counter those views within the Western world that want to throw out much, if not more, of the inherited structure of international law and society. And I think that gets then to, well, where might we go? And I was sort of actually wondering this morning is, we often play with a kind of process versus substance discussion about the rule of law and international law. And it's either we agree deeply on all of the substantive values and substantive outcomes on the one hand, or we have this kind of pluralist, we have a procedural view where, certainly in the legal sense, there are certain things about international law which constitute a good process. And it seems to me that one of the ways forward is to, certainly kind of theoretically and conceptually, is to open up and unpack what we mean on the process and the procedural side. So one part of that might be, in quite old-fashioned ways, what are the minimum procedural conditions there have to be for a plural world to exist? And that's where clearly equality comes. That's where some basic understandings, what does it depend to have dialogue, communication, contracting, diplomacy, all of those things, old style sort of English school stuff, if you like. Secondly, the crucial question is not so much about specific legal norms, it might be, but it's often about who makes law, who interprets it. That's where the procedural inequalities are arguably greatest, but that still sort of works at maybe at the formal level of a lot of the stuff that's out there in law and global governance. But the third level, which is the one that I think touches what many people here today have been talking about, is that the interpretation of a kind of global and international law has also to speak to not just to the background conditions of Western culture and history, but also to the background conditions and cultural values and historical trajectories of a much broader range of societies. That kind of tapestry of legality and tapestry of understandings about society, which are so varied across. And it's that kind of third level, which we haven't really got beyond, because when we talk about interpretation, we in the West almost always think about our own background assumptions about what law is, about what norms are, about what rights are, and so on. But if we're moving to a more plural system, which there's still some shared process, it's that level that has to be opened up to a much wider range of interpretive moves. So it's those three things: the kind of minimal first level, the second, the sort of the traditional stuff of law and global governance, and the third level, the deeper one, is how does law speak to these background understandings of what order, society, progress, future, development, planetary, all of the things are as they come from different places.
Thank you, Hurrell. I think it's very helpful to separate these questions into the sort of the discrete the component parts. And I was also reminded of one of the Soviet representatives in the interwar period saying that the West, in the context of the League of Nations, liked to work with the parliamentary method. And he was saying that dismissively because he partly thought it was a sham and partly because he wasn't getting through to them from this outside perspective. And then he was obviously suggesting that a different procedural way of dealing with international issues should be developed. I'm not sure whether he wanted a return to classical diplomacy, but he definitely had different views on how to procedurally engage different political systems. I see that Dine Gissel has her hand up, so I'll hand it over to her, and then Courtney Fung afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Sashi, for that really good question. And I think that's one of the most important questions. How do we make this table more equal? And I think that's where Hannah Arendt can also help us in terms of highlighting disobedience. Because if everyone or half of the participants leave that table, the table ends up not looking very legitimate. So maybe there's been a lot of concerns about backlash, but backlash by Global South actors also it has had its uses at the International Criminal Court, at least, because it has served to sort of highlight biases and inequalities within the regime. So maybe sort of not violence, but disobedience, which is could be a tool, but also just to say that, of course, international order, in my view, relies on international law. But I think that since the end of the Cold War, maybe there's been too much confidence in international law as the solution to all problems. And that has caused this devaluation of the political process. So not to say we should sort of abandon international law, but sort of remember that law or legal and political processes and institutions actually do different things. Yeah. So the law cannot replace politics. And that has been, I think, what the sort of hubris that we have seen since the end of the Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you, Gissel, and over to Courtney Fung.
I'd just like to pick up on a couple of threads that have gone, I think, in the Q&A conversation. And I think as we think about questions of order, I think it is also important to think about processes of parallel order making too. And the way that, I think exactly as was hit upon in the opening comments, the way that feedback from below, from the Global South, from atypical international leaders apparently, are helping us understand shifts and the way that order itself at the global level in the broadest sense is being understood. So if I can take an opening, since someone has actually mentioned the word cyber, I think it is very interesting to watch sort of the way that Chinese diplomats, other foreign policy specialists are engaging, in the sense that there are test cases of trying to enter UN General Assembly debate. Then the decisions that maybe it is more effective to try and operate through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, as a foundational group, and then therefore launch an effort that speaks on behalf of a group of states that have particular interests as they think about the future of sort of cyber sovereignty. They would all be very encouraging of it. Attempts then to also create its own internet norm diffusion node. So their own internet forum that's now been upgraded to an actual institutional standing. So not just a perpetual dialogue space once a year. Again, the ways in which these injections are fed in, I think it exactly goes back to this question of the way in which one rejects or pushes back the use of actual formal institutional procedures. So it is going through the same sort of pathways, dialogue, engagement, institution building, but fundamentally in order to try and reconfigure how one asks for a seat at the table, to therefore make sure that the table is fully representative. I also just think the last thing just to point out that I think we are at a very interesting moment. I think this hasn't been a very clear theme in the discussion. I would just like to hear the other participants' views. I think in the sense, as we move into this sort of summit of the future, I think the violence in Gaza, Ukraine, Russia's ability to sort of break even the most base acceptance, about sovereignty as being something that should be respected, the fact that the UN Charter is meant to be the baseline for the way that states operate and do not violate state sovereignty, territorial integrity. I think it has called into question the nature in which fundamentally this question of order can be understood in our time, in a way that I think provides the type of political opening for states that are seeking a very different future, to actually really come to the table and make the case that the table itself is broken. So I think I'd be curious to hear about sort of the way that external events are acting upon order making. But thank you.
Thank you, Courtney Fung. And I'll just point out that we have a few minutes left of what has so far been a very good discussion. I would like to give Aaron McKeil the opportunity to come in if he so desires.
Oh, thank you, Laust. Yeah, I didn't have a formulated question, but as we're running out of time, I'd like to thank everyone for their excellent, thoughtful contributions. It seems to me that the era in which we can solve international order problems by fixing new rules is somehow on pause, at least. It seems to be an era in which states are using other tools of statecraft and order making at their disposal. It seems to be an era of strategic disorder, using low-level, below threshold tools of statecraft to coerce and deter to maintain or modify the international order according to their strategic preferences. Seems to be long-term unfortunate condition that I'm trying to study in my own time.
Thank you, Aaron McKeil. And Sasi, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I think this is a superb discussion for fantastic reflection. I want to pick up on 2 points that was brought up earlier. One is the tension between competitive rulemaking and dialogical rulemaking. And I think that's a very interesting point, because to some extent, if competitive rulemaking can protect the egg box, so to speak, then shouldn't competitive rulemaking be allowed? And it looks like with an overemphasis on dialogical rulemaking for across the world, we've kind of undermined the sort of ability for competitive rulemaking to help protect the egg box. But this leads to a bigger problem that Courtney Fung points out, of how external events then impact these sort of competitive rulemaking. Because if we allow for different competitive rulemaking, then different perceptions of external events make a big difference. So some might engage in competitive rulemaking under the perception that an important external event to be attentive is climate change, and others might think it is radical right-wing polarization. So external events sort of influencing to some extent on these differences between competitive and dialogical rulemaking is absolutely fascinating. This creates, in my view, at least, a fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is our search for some sort of a minimal condition to establish pluralism to work. And over again, with the external events showing us that these minimal conditions are not met by interlocutors themselves who set these minimal conditions. And in many ways, with Israel-Palestine and with Russia-Ukraine war, the sort of hypocrisies that was shown in the West in the way that issues were treated, and some lives were seen as important and others were not seen as important and sort of dispensable, allows at least the global South states to see that establishing minimal condition or those minimal conditions that will be contravened in practice when external events take over. So I think we are in a contradiction or a sort of a paradoxical world where we constantly have and must search for a minimal condition, and those minimal conditions are contravened in practice over and over again. And in that sense, Line's point on disobedience and civil disobedience, the greatest theorist of it and the practitioner of it is Mahatma Gandhi. And I think the notion of civil disobedience would be a right way to some extent to sort of chastise the West in many ways. But again, this brings back the contradiction of how there are polarized tensions even within the non-West, and how sort of taking up the position of chastising the West could lead to more and more rigorous forms of exclusionary behavior within the non-Western states, such as India, Brazil, and China.
Very good. I think that speaks to a sort of universal flaw or lowest common denominator for pluralism and whether that's achievable and what it is. Does anyone want to have the daunting final word of this roundtable? Okay. Then in that case, let me just thank all the speakers, the participants. So Dr. Courtney Fung, Dr. Line Engbo Gissel, Professor Andrew Hurrell, and Dr. Aaron McKeil, and Dr. Sasikumar Sundaram. I think this has been an excellent conversation, and I look forward to continuing it in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.